So our next speaker is coming to us live from New York. It is Urbina. Ian is a reporter and author who writes for the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and others. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Outlaw Ocean, based on 5 years of reporting, much of it offshore, exploring lawlessness on the high seas. Ian, welcome to Dublin and to Food on the Edge. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak for about 13 minutes. Today, my goal is to talk about what we do at the Outlaw Ocean Project and to some degree attempt to explain how it's very much connected with global concerns about food. So a bit of context. For 17 years, I was on staff at the New York Times. I was an investigative reporter and I covered a range of topics, normally international topics related to worker issues or environmental concerns, human rights concerns. In 2014, 2015, I began a series called The Outlaw Ocean. And that series looked at human rights, labor, and environmental abuses at sea. It's important to remember that the oceans cover 2/3 of the planet's surface, and more than 50 million people work out there. Half of the oxygen we breathe comes from the oceans. And in some places in the world, over 50% of the protein that is consumed comes from those same waters. And so this is a realm that is quite essential and bustling. And yet it's a realm from which we rarely see journalistic stories and sort of sustained investigative explanatory journalism. So that was the void that we hoped to fill with the series. And quite especially, as is typical of investigative reporting, our goal was to highlight things that are broken, shed light on them with the hope that others would engage to fix them. A huge part of the concerns that emerged, be it murder of stowaways, intentional dumping of oil, arms trafficking at sea, human slavery, illegal fishing, overfishing, plastic pollution, coral reef decimation, and on and on. A huge variety of the concerns out there seem to be most acute on the distant water fishing fleet. So if you think of the oceans as a place, as a workplace, you can often divide it into two categories. One is the merchant marine. Those are ships that carry stuff, oil or grain or Adidas shoes or iPhones. And the other and more plentiful realm from a workplace standpoint is the fishing fleet. And the distant water fishing fleet are those vessels that go very far from shore and often stay out at sea for a long time. Some vessels stay out at sea for over a year, year and a half. So we want to look at the human rights and labor concerns on those vessels. And they were pretty acute and diverse. Now, how is this a food issue? I'll dive sort of abruptly into one story in particular and attempt to retell it a bit and sort of show how these climate crisis concerns, these human rights concerns, all connect to the global food system. This was a story that came out in the New Yorker magazine about 9 months ago. It was a piece that took me and my photographer to the tiny, actually Africa's tiniest continental country, which is to say the tiniest country on the continent of Africa, namely Gambia. West African country, heavily dependent on artisanal fishing, i.e. small fishermen who go out for a day and come back. And there was a huge influx of foreign fishing vessels, quite especially Chinese fishing vessels. And these were industrial scale vessels. And what was interesting about what was happening in Gambia, but also in other West African nations, Mauritania, Senegal, was that there were huge numbers, in Gambia's case, 13 large factories that were being set up. And these were factories to take fish and convert it into fish meal. So fish meal is this interesting product. It's fish that's ground up and turned into pellets or powder. And the reason you do that is because it's high in protein, easy to transport, and fed not for human consumption, but to chicken, pigs, cattle to some degree, but quite especially farmed fish. So just pause for a second and think about that. You have fish being pulled from the ocean, ground up, pelletized, made into a powder, exported typically, and then spread out so as to feed and fatten up and bring to market faster farmed fish. Farmed fish means, pens, large pens, half mile, in size, that are near shore where you raise your own fish, or on land pools where you raise your own fish. And this is sort of a method of initially aquaculture, as it's called, or farm fishing, was meant to slow the rate of ocean depletion. The rate at which the oceans were running out of wild caught fish was worrisome. So the thought was, let's start growing them ourselves in pens or on land. A good ambition for the planet and for food stability. The problem became when the industry that was doing this began attempting to fatten up those fish and get them more marketable, more profitable, and to market sooner by way of using ground up wild caught fish. Then you had an upside down system that was doing the exact opposite of what it was partially set up to do. So we went to Gambia to take a look at this dark irony and how it was playing out, and how these foreign industrial boats were essentially pillaging the waters of West Africa, in this case specifically Gambia, depleting the fish stock there, and having serious repercussions for the food security of average Gambians. This is where it gets really interesting, in the sense that you have an environmental concern that quickly factors into a political concern, because you had political destabilization happening in Gambia, where you had young people who were attempting to protest these factories being suppressed quite violently, and sometimes even disappeared by their own elected officials. And so you had an anti-democratic repercussion occurring, because the government was very worried about the popular uprising scaring away foreign investment, namely Chinese investment. And you also have really dire implications on the family level, because most of the local folk who sell the fish that was running out, that was being redirected into the factories and ground up, and instead was not making it to the local mouths for consumption. Most of those tabletop markets that are right along the seafront are run by women. So in many countries, but in Gambia, most of the fishmongers are women. And as such, when you undercut them and their financial stability, you have major implications for the family structure, the nutritional well-being of the kids, the access to education of those children starts to bottom out, because the breadwinner, or one of the main breadwinners in the family, is the mother. And when she goes out of business because no fish is ending up on our table, instead it's getting sent to the factory, then you've got a real crumbling of a central pillar in society. So, and then the third element is a food-specific element. You have this crazy situation where this bonga fish, which was previously so plentiful that it was often free in some places at these markets, now being so expensive because it's needing to compete with this huge industrial factory that's exporting it as powder. And so local folk are not having access to a main source of protein. And what source of protein they often do have access to is imported chicken. often from China, not to demonize China, but and so you have a very sort of third element of destabilization occurring. So this is sort of a quintessential story in which you have seafood, a specific seafood supply chain, a specific concern about industrial large-scale overfishing, a specific region that is distinctly vulnerable because Gambia has no Coast Guard or Navy and therefore can't go out on the water and police its own rules and stop these vessels, having really deep-seated impacts. And this is the type of story that we at the Outlaw Ocean Project focus on. And we attempt to distribute these stories globally in a different way. I'll just talk briefly. I know this is a bit off topic from a food perspective, but one of the things we do differently, and actually we work with the Irish Times quite consistently, including on this story, which is run in Ireland, is we self-fund the stories. We work with philanthropies that fund part of the journalism because it's a very expensive type of reporting to do. We also work with musicians around the world that team up with us and take some of the sounds from our reporting, convert it into music, hip hop, electronic, classical, folk, reggae, then publish it. And half of any revenue made on the music goes back to the musician. And the other half is a charitable donation into our nonprofit, which 100% of which goes towards doing more stories. Because journalism is a losing business financially these days. And so we have to find other ways to make long form international investigative reporting financially viable. And this is one example. So I bring that up simply because I do think a conference about food is probably a place, as I saw from your last speakers, that brings lots of different stakeholders, lots of different types of advocates and analysts and what have you into one place to talk about a center concern. And the Outlaw Ocean Project is quite aimed at doing much the same in the form of doing good journalism about stories and places that rarely get covered, distributing it in a different way, hopefully, and in a sustainable way on topics that are essential to anyone that worries about the fate of food on the planet. Thanks so much.